Survive 30 days in -20 degrees Celsius to win a $500,000 prize. 3 strangers, without any tools, are only provided with a large amount of food by the show. How many days could you last? A crew member fired a flare into the sky, and the contestants immediately rushed ashore toward the airdrop. They soon spotted a moose weighing over 1,000 pounds. Eating sparingly, this should suffice until their departure. The priority now is to find tools to cut the meat. Viewers of Bear and ED know that striking stones can produce sharp edges, though it's harder than it seems. Even Nathan, skilled in survival techniques, struggled to make a usable tool. To prevent the meat from spoiling, they hurried to clean the organs. Anne, with experience in handling moose, continuously sliced with a stone knife to make a large cut, reaching inside to pull out the organs. Processing the moose took a lot of time. They had to split up to build shelters. Joe, who had survived alone in the wild for years, volunteered to build the shelter. It turned out he just stacked some branches, hardly windproof, and it would surely be cold tonight. Anne was still struggling to remove the heart and lungs. This was her first time dealing with such a large moose, and the organs were bigger than expected. With bears in the vicinity, there was a risk of attracting them. The shelter Joe built provided little protection from the wind, and he spent the night coughing and feeling cold. Nathan found a place nearby to store the meat, which was enough to last several days. To preserve it longer, they resorted to smoking the meat. Locals used their mouths and knees to hold a board, twisting a stick wrapped with deer hide ropes to start a fire. Nathan worked hard to successfully light the fire, and finally they could roast some meat. Joe's health deteriorated. He couldn't even eat the roasted meat. Realizing the prize money wasn't worth his life, he decided to signal the crew with a flare and left on a boat, leaving Anne and Nathan behind. Just on the second day, the trio was down to 2. Although Joe had quit, a neighboring bear seemed interested in joining, likely enticed by the food. Nathan and Anne were not pleased with this new member. Their main task now was to smoke the large deer legs, using deerskin to create a simple chimney for the meat. The temperature was extremely low at night, with continuous snowfall. Nathan shivered through the night, unable to sleep. The blizzard soaked their shelter, and they had to repair it today to keep the food and themselves dry, stacking branches on the tent to create a waterproof barrier. The Arctic environment was harsh, and it was difficult to stay warm. Worse still, bear roars at night frightened Nathan, who went out to see the bear sneaking some food. Furious, he threw a stone at it. Although it quieted down, it didn't bring much comfort. Nathan thought all night and felt the bear was too dangerous. He wanted to be there for his child's growth, and chose to quit the challenge. Anne was shocked to hear this news. She hadn't expected that living together in the wilderness would end up as surviving alone. She thought about persuading Nathan to persist, but he wasn't listening. He went to the shore, fired a flare, and left. Now, with more than 20 days left, Anne had to survive alone in the Arctic. She had to handle everything herself, which was several times more difficult. However, the thought of winning $500,000 all to herself immediately energized her. The only problem was the neighboring bear that came nightly to steal food. Even with Joe and Nathan around, they couldn't subdue it. Anne consoled herself that there was still plenty of meat left. Unexpectedly, the bear became bolder, brazenly eating in front of her and seeming quite pleased. Once the bear was full, Anne quickly dragged the remains farther from the camp. With her small stature, she could only move them slowly. With 15 days left to complete the challenge, it was uncertain if she could make it. Who would have thought that eating dried meat every day in the wilderness would hurt her gums? Anne needed fresh food from hunting. She had wanted to make a bow and arrow, but the stone knife was too ineffective to be sharpened conveniently. She gave up and looked for another tool. Moose bones nearby seemed good enough to stun prey. The most common prey around was the grouse. Although Anne was weakened, she was very confident in her hunting skills. Spotting a grouse from a distance, she slowly approached it from behind and, without it noticing, hurled the bone hard. Surprisingly, she knocked the grouse out with one hit. After simple processing, she roasted the meat over the fire. It wasn't as delicious as moose meat, but was very tasty nonetheless. The only concern was the bear, which recently lingered near the camp and sometimes dared to come close to the fire for warmth. It might eventually sleep in the camp. Anne did not want to get too close to it. At dawn, she checked how much meat was left, only enough for a few days. For safety, Anne decided to move farther away. Deerskin was perfect for packing everything. The most important thing was to carry the fire embers. Luckily, there was plenty of birch wood around. She placed the embers inside it, which theoretically could burn for several hours, enough time for her to find a new place and reignite the fire. I don't know how long I've been walking here, but I am now quite far from the camp. Along the way, I kept checking the state of the fire embers. Without fire, I would have to give up the challenge, as the embers could go out at any moment. Nathan had a hard time starting it, and now I can't survive alone. I quickly found a flat spot and reignited the fire. It's too late to build a shelter, so I just piled up some branches on the ground and added deerskin, which provided a bit of warmth. I had to make do for the night. It was colder than I expected last night, which made it unbearably cold for Anne. As soon as dawn broke, I could start gathering materials to build a shelter. I simply piled the branches together and finally placed a piece of deerskin on top, barely blocking some of the cold wind. In the following days, I tried to conserve energy by lying in the camp as much as possible. No one expected that by enduring hunger, Anne would successfully last until the final day. Now, all I need to do is pick up the souvenir and I can leave. I can't wait to go back and empty my shopping cart. This is the most conscientious wilderness survival challenge, starting off by giving each contestant a large muskox for free, staying outdoors for a month, and a chance to win a $500,000 prize. The only requirement is not to bring any tools. How many days could you last? As the production team fired the starting signal, the challenge officially began. 3 strong men rushed to the airdrop point looking for supplies. What caught their eye was a muskox weighing over 1,000 pounds. The production team was indeed generous, starting with a tough challenge. They had to process this cow before it rotted. Robert volunteered to find stones to make into a knife, the easiest way to obtain a cutting tool. It took him a lot of effort to find some sharp enough. Ben's brother had once survived alone in the wilderness until the end, and he also wanted to try his luck and return home. But cutting through the cowhide was really difficult. The stone knife was like scraping, and it took a great effort to cut through a little. As the temperature rose, the meat would spoil quickly. It was important to preserve as much usable meat as possible. Shane was a retired veteran, very confident in his abilities. Although there were black bears nearby, he wasn't worried about being attacked. However, he was concerned that the bears might come to steal the meat. It took a lot of effort for the 3 of them to successfully detach a leg. This large piece of meat would last them several days. Ben now needed to find a way to preserve the meat. There was no time to smoke it over a fire, so he had to cool it in water. This temporarily prevented the meat from spoiling too quickly. He carefully observed the surroundings. There were many fresh bear tracks on the ground. Hopefully, the scent of the meat hadn't reached them. With a little time before dark, they had to detach all the legs. Everyone exerted all their strength to cut off the meat. Several stone knives broke in the process. After working hard for most of the day, they barely managed to process the meat. As night approached, they didn't even have time to make fire or build shelters. With temperatures just below 0, they simply covered themselves with some branches for the night, shivering through the cold. At dawn, the 3 men went to check if the meat had spoiled. Unexpectedly, one of the ox legs they had placed in the river was missing, which infuriated them. There were many bear tracks nearby. Following the tracks, they indeed found the stolen ox leg, which bore bite marks. It was fortunate they recovered it at all. Returning to the shore, they encountered a black bear nearby. Shane immediately threw rocks at it, startling the bear, which they didn't expect to be so brazen. Ben even thought about charging at it to give it a lesson. However, the bear quickly ran away. Surprised by its boldness, they weren't sure when it might return. If they didn't have so much to do that day, they might have chased after it to teach it a lesson. They quickly moved the meat to another location and then prioritized starting a fire to prevent the meat from spoiling. Though they had no fire-starting tools, this wasn't a significant challenge for them. The 3 split up to gather dry materials and even wove fibers from the tree roots into a rope. They soon created a fire-starting tool and tried to generate sparks by pulling the rope back and forth. Although smoke began to appear, the rope snapped, and after several attempts, they still couldn't start a fire. The situation worsened as the bear returned to steal the meat. Shane, unable to contain his anger, loudly scared off the bear. They had to get a fire going, otherwise they wouldn't notice the bear at night. They continuously adjusted their approach until Ben remembered the abundant hair on the muskox. They collected it, hoping the woven rope would hold. This time the rope didn't break, and they quickly produced some sparks, which they placed into tinder. Robert blew gently, and the smoke thickened until the fire started. Starting the fire was exhausting, but it wasn't time to rest yet. They hurried to smoke the meat, placing the large ox leg over the fire, which needed to smoke for several days. Ben cut as much meat as possible to eat, and even used the tendons as fishing line. The stone knives were inconvenient, causing many cuts on their hands. To deter the bear from stealing, they even burned the unprocessed remains of the muskox, a harsh measure. After spending so much time in the wilderness, they could finally sit down and taste the beef, which was tougher than expected. It wasn't suitable for those with poor teeth. They missed the beefsteak from home and strongly suggested that the production team provide tastier food next time. After eating and drinking their fill, they gathered around the fire to rest. I wondered how they could sleep in such cold. Shane, unable to bear being woken by the cold, planned to build a stove at first light. He slightly excavated a slope, stacked some stones, and based on this, constructed a simple shelter, which looked quite nice. They believed they would sleep well that night. It rained during the night, but fortunately, they had built the shelter during the day, sparing them from getting wet. To sleep more comfortably, they planned to use the smoked ox hide as bed sheets. More hides would have been even better. Lying on the ox hide was much more comfortable than a hotel bed. Now, with everything they needed, one might think they were on vacation. This contestant is definitely the best at enjoying himself. While others are still worrying about food, they not only smoked the meat, but also made their shelter very comfortable. Now, they plan to team up to make fishing rods. Bones polished into fish hooks and continuously woven ox tendons form durable fishing lines. They use dried meat as bait, which is quite luxurious. Each of them chose a fishing spot to see who could catch the biggest fish. The wind here is stronger than expected, and the waves keep pushing the bait ashore. Soon, Robert gave up, leaving only Shane persisting. But unfortunately, he caught nothing all day and had to go back to gnawing on dried beef. Ben heard a squirrel's call in the bushes, and, having never eaten one, decided to catch it. He threw a stone and surprisingly hit it, showing great skill. Robert skillfully separated the skin from the meat, simply processed it, and roasted it over the fire. This was much tastier than dried beef. Biting into it was crunchy. With time on their hands, the three went to the river to practice pottery. Shane and Ben quickly made what looked like decent pots and placed them next to the fire to dry. Unexpectedly, the items exploded, but fortunately, no one was hurt. It seems their pottery skills have room for improvement. Shane planned to grind bones into powder to mix into the clay for added hardness, which significantly improved the results. Now, the meat tasted even better. Ben also made a hatchet, though he regretted not seeing any black bears to test its effectiveness. Unknowingly, they had been here for 28 days, either gnawing on dried meat or fishing by the sea. Isn't this the retirement life others envy? After fishing for so many days, they had learned the habits of the fish and were determined to catch one today. Suddenly, there was movement on Shane's hook. Ben immediately rushed to help, and before the fish knew it, it was hit several times. They finally caught a fish before leaving, satisfying Shane. Seeing them carry the big fish back to camp left Robert stunned. Processing such a big fish was very easy, and he hadn't tasted fresh meat in a long time. He took a piece directly to his mouth, and it was delicious. They grilled the rest over the fire, which tasted much better than dried meat. Now they wished they could replace all the dried meat with fish. It must be said that they ate too comfortably during this challenge. It felt more considerate than a vacation. With a chance to win $500,000, is it still possible to sign up now? Today is the day they leave. And actually, they wanted to stay a few more days. Unfortunately, the production team didn't want to continue and told them to pack up and leave. Thus, they completed the challenge happily. There is now a chance to become rich overnight. Just surviving in the wilderness for 30 days can earn you $500,000, and the production team even provides a muskox weighing over 1,000 pounds to eat, provided no tools are brought along. How many days could you last? The familiar flare burst into the sky, and the three strangers immediately rushed ashore towards the airdrop point. The 1,000-pound muskox was lying on the ground, still warm. They had to clean the innards before the meat spoiled, and they needed to find suitable stones to craft cutting tools. Fortunately, there were plenty of rocks on the shore, ideally looking for ones with more layers for easier separation. It took quite some effort to get satisfactory stone tools. Shane is a retired veteran with extensive survival skills and handles stone knives with ease. Anne, a biologist experienced in animal dissection, finds cutting with stone for the first time quite exhausting. Nathan, a survival instructor skilled in tool making, ventures nearby as dusk approaches, hoping to find suitable materials for fire-starting tools. Typically, fire is made using a hand drill, which is fortunate here due to the dry materials, though they still require much time. Previously, Nathan could start a fire in minutes, but now he sees no smoke. He looks for better materials nearby and finds spruce roots, which can be used as cordage to apply steady pressure. Meanwhile, the dissection group is still cleaning the organs. It's their first time handling such a large animal, and the stone knives are not very sharp, making the task more tiring than expected. They take turns pulling, and it takes considerable effort to remove the heart. With only an hour until dark, they have extracted the organs, and the meat should last until tomorrow without spoiling. The main concern is other animals stealing the meat, dependent on Nathan's success in starting a fire. The spruce roots are too short, and Nathan struggles to create a spark, becoming quite disheartened. Shane sees this and helps, but they remain busy until dark without fire. The first night they must huddle together to keep warm. Anne finds the lack of fire terrible as the ground is wet, and they shiver all night. Although the sunlight warms them, it also speeds up the meat's decay. They cover the meat with moss to cool it before they can light a fire. Nathan doesn't know how long he's been drilling until his hands are nearly blistered, but he finally gets a spark. He quickly places it into tinder and blows, successfully lighting the fire. They are overjoyed and quickly roast the beef heart, which tastes better than anything. They have many tasks ahead and wonder if they can complete the challenge. With thousands of pounds of beef, 3 people can't eat it all quickly. To avoid waste, they build a simple smoking rack, cutting the meat into smaller pieces, hoping to preserve it longer through smoking, which will take several days. However, the weather is uncooperative, raining lightly since last night, and their clothes never dry. They've been busy and only now remember to build a shelter. The meat gets wet, but fortunately, the fire remains lit. Now, the priority is to build a shelter and move the dried meat. They are not in good spirits, but endure discomfort to gather wood nearby and quickly build a simple shelter, barely fitting 2 people while the third keeps the fire. Nathan moves the dried meat into the shelter, hoping it keeps them drier. They've been here 7 days, and their stomachs remain empty. They plan to use the stomach as a water container. Shane suggests eating its contents to soothe their stomachs, though it looks unpleasant, but smells like broccoli. Nathan thinks it might be okay to eat. After heating by the fire, Anne, despite feeling nauseous, eats it, finding it tastes like chewing tobacco. Perhaps it would taste better with dried meat. Injuries in the wilderness are especially prone to infection. They slowly boil ash in water, and after it cools, they mix in some other substances to use it like soap. There are many cinnamon trees nearby, and they burn some in the fire, infusing the smoked meat with a fragrant aroma. The smoking seems to be going well, but the camp lacks insulation. Shane plans to make a larger animal skin blanket for warmth, as cutting with stone tools takes a lot of time. Nathan thinks the stones are pretty good, and he goes to the shore to look for better ones. While Shane is showing off his stone tools, the smoking rack suddenly catches fire. They can't extinguish it, and can only watch as the dried meat turns to ashes. Nathan rushes back when he sees the smoke, not expecting all the meat to be gone after only a brief absence. Anne panics as she doesn't know how to hunt, and it's difficult to survive on the remaining meat. Nathan has severe stomach pains, making it hard for him to stand. He needs other nutrients to soothe his stomach. Anne suggests grinding antlers into powder for their mineral content, hoping it would help. However, Nathan's stomach pain persists overnight. Nathan, considering his deteriorating health, decides to forego the $500,000 prize with 15 days left in the challenge. It's uncertain if they can complete the challenge without Nathan. To make the remaining dried meat more palatable, they collect berries. They grind the dried meat into smaller pieces, but the stones at hand aren't effective. Shane uses cattle bones to crush the dried meat, which also lets them roast the bone marrow for eating. Anne heats the fat and marrow to extract some oil, which adds a delicious flavor when fried with the berries. They mix everything together, creating a beef ball that tastes sweet and sour, much tastier than the dried meat. Although Nathan has left the challenge, They are managing reasonably well. While gathering firewood nearby, Shane finds a lot of moose dung, which isn't good news. With their limited weapons and strength, they are not capable of hunting. Encountering moose means they could only be pushed around. It's also mating season, and disturbing them could lead to an attack. They have no better way to prepare and hope the fire in the camp will be useful. Indeed, in the middle of the night, Anne hears something nearby and wakes Shane to check. They see a moose wandering not far away, which frightens them. They don't know if it will charge. After waiting a while, fortunately, the moose doesn't approach the camp, but it keeps them awake all night. Anne realizes for the first time how dangerous the wilderness can be. She thought enduring hunger would be enough until they feel slightly safer at dawn. Day 22 has arrived, and there's not much dried meat left. They need to find more food. Squirrels are commonly seen on the trees. After a long search, they finally spot one. The two position themselves on opposite sides and slowly circle behind it. The squirrel sits in the tree, watching. Shane sees his chance, quickly signals Anne to bring the spear, and strikes. Unfortunately, he misses, and the effort is too exhausting. It seems easier to catch fish in the water. Shane plans to trap fish by making a circle of branches and placing rotten meat inside as bait, though he's unsure if the fish will like it. The water is colder than expected, and working in it feels freezing. Over the next few days, Shane checks the trap, but it's always empty. Not wanting to soak in the water anymore, they decide to just lie in camp and starve. Unknowingly, the last day arrives. They plan to dismantle the camp. If successful, each person will win $250,000. They take souvenirs, eager to squander their earnings. This is the most thrilling challenge I've seen. The show randomly selects 3 strangers to team up and provides them with a massive amount of food, just needing to survive 30 days in the Arctic at minus 20 degrees Celsius to win $500,000 with no tools allowed. From afar, they see a flare and immediately rush to the airdrop site, confident about the challenge. But seeing a moose lying on the ground, they panic slightly, having never dealt with such a large animal. Now, it's crucial to find rocks to fashion cutting tools to clean the innards. Jason, a retired veteran with survival experience, finds suitable rocks, although they aren't very sharp. Nathan, a hunter, struggles to make the first cut using stone tools. Amy, a forest ranger familiar with local plants, notices signs of black bears nearby and worries the moose might attract them. With a couple of hours until dark, she plans to collect more wood to build a better shelter. Jason wants Amy's help making ropes from the fur while he gathers wood for the shelter. Amy quickly processes the fur, removing excess hair. Nathan, working alone on the moose, worries about contaminating the meat by accidentally cutting the stomach. He finds the stone tools frustrating as they quickly blunt and need constant sharpening, praying to finish before dark. When the shelter is nearly complete, it's time to start a fire. They try the traditional bow drill method, but despite the smoke, no sparks are produced. It's harder than expected, and they repeatedly attempt to start the fire. Nathan, just finished with his tasks, sees the fire still not lit and feels panicked. They continue working into the dark without fire. Animal noises fill the night, and they can only hold each other, barely making it to dawn. It's extremely cold, and besides reinforcing the shelter, their top priority is to get a fire going. This time, they prepare drier materials, but with little success. A large chunk of meat sits uneaten. Amy suggests eating bone marrow, the only food they don't need to cook. They smash the bones with stones, quickly revealing the fresh-smelling marrow inside, providing them with much-needed warmth and comfort. They continued trying to start a fire. One person pressed down, while the other 2 pulled back and forth. Despite their efforts, it was still ineffective. Jason could only add grease to lubricate it. This made the friction much smoother. Soon, white smoke started to appear, followed by a tiny spark. Jason quickly placed it into the tinder and, by continuously fanning and blowing, finally managed to start the fire. It was indeed a difficult task. They didn't know what other challenges awaited them. You wouldn't expect that deer heart could be eaten this way. She first cut a slit in the outer layer, then poured berries into the heart cavity. They placed it on a stone and slowly cooked it with the heat of the flames. They were unsure about the taste, but they seemed to enjoy it immensely. They had been there for 4 days, preparing to turn the deer tendons into ropes. These tendons had to be torn and twisted into strands. Amy tried to process the heart's outer skin into a container, while there was still a lot of unprocessed meat from the moose. They weren't worried about black bears possibly coming around. As the weather grew colder, they didn't plan on smoking the meat. They left it as it was without worrying about it rotting. Unexpectedly, it started to snow. Snow melted on the roof and dripped into the camp. Amy's health was deteriorating while staying here. They didn't know how to improve the shelter, which was even less dry than the small grove outside. Jason suggested building a new shelter outside. Amy and Nathan also thought it was a good idea. The three collected a lot of wood nearby. To avoid previous issues, they built a different type of structure. Working in the snow, they were soaked through. Amy felt her body temperature drop significantly. Jason could only make her drink more hot water. Amy returned to the previous camp to dry off. She was starting to catch a cold and hoped the hot water would help. Once Amy warmed up a bit, she went to the moose and took a calf. She planned to add its fur to her shoes to keep her feet from staying wet. It was a good idea, but using stone tools was really exhausting. It took her a lot of effort to make them. Meanwhile, the new shelter was almost finished. They hoped to have a good night's sleep. Although the new shelter was decent, the continuous snow and low temperatures made it uncomfortable. Even with a fire nearby, it felt extremely cold. They could only drink more hot water each day. To make the stomach last longer, Jason was making a coil basket for support, which would make boiling water more convenient. They put hot stones into the water, and soon they had a pot of hot drink. Now, with temperatures just below freezing, Amy's health was getting worse. She often felt dizzy, nauseous, and wanted to vomit. She could only rest as much as possible at the camp. By the 14th day, Amy's health had not improved. She lay on the ground completely listless. For safety, they called a doctor. After a brief examination, he advised Amy to go to the hospital for a thorough checkup. After much thought, Amy had no choice but to give up and quit the challenge. With the team down one member, the need for firewood didn't decrease. More physical effort was required, and it was uncertain if they could successfully complete the challenge. Staying in a place frequented by black bears for 30 days earns you $500,000. Would you dare? Jason usually collects firewood nearby. Unexpectedly, he found fresh blood traces. He wasn't sure which animal was hunting. The location wasn't too far or too close to their camp, and they worried whether the deer meat would attract predators. For safety, they decided to centralize the meat and build a rack next to the camp. This way, even if predators did come, they would have enough time to react. The meat was so appealing, it's no wonder predators were interested. At night, they often heard animal sounds, indicating predators were nearing their camp. After Amy left, they had to take turns keeping watch and collecting firewood outside, which was truly exhausting. Nathan saw clear animal tracks a bit farther away. With his years of wilderness experience, he identified them as Wolverine tracks. Unfortunately, the tracks headed towards the moose and their camp. Wolverines are bold enough to challenge black bears, and Nathan knew better than to provoke them. He followed the tracks and indeed found the moose had been gnawed on. Fortunately, they had already moved the meat, which wouldn't be enough for a wolverine, meaning it would likely come to their camp looking for more. The Wolverine team came to feed at night and would probably reach their camp in a few days. Jason and Nathan wanted to stay until the end and had to prepare some means of defense. While collecting materials, Jason saw many tracks near the camp. To protect their food and safety, Nathan prepared to make a torch by scraping off resin and melting it to cover the torch head. Once lit, it would be bright and burn for a long time. The torch was simply moss tied with some grass, long enough to keep wolverines at bay and even retaliate. They dared not sleep all night, as the sound of wolverines approaching the camp was too close, and it was too dark to see them clearly. The two tried to make noise to drive them away. They could only take turns keeping watch that night. Already miserable, they endured the wind and snow, wishing they could warm their feet by the fire. They had been there for 28 days. Just 2 more days for a chance to win $500,000. Besides eating meat, most of their time was spent repairing the shelter. If nothing unexpected happened, they could make it through the remaining days. Indeed, they spent the rest of the days at the camp. Using the meat provided by the show was sufficient, though avoiding the cold required more effort. Regardless, they successfully stayed for 30 days. If I told you staying 30 days in a swamp earns you $500,000 and you start with precious ingredients, Wouldn't that excite you? The show arranged for 3 strangers to team up and face the challenge without bringing anything. Crew members fired a flare to mark the spot, and the 3 men immediately rushed to the drop point. The swamp was more dangerous than their previous Arctic location. The show specifically sent a large alligator for them to eat. The alligator was large, but they lacked cutting tools. The surface of the alligator was thick and hard, difficult to cut with ordinary knives. Additionally, with the hot weather, the meat would spoil quickly. Next, they had to deal with the alligator and make a fire to better preserve the meat. Hudson grew up near a swamp and knows how to handle alligators. Previous contestants used rocks as cutting tools, but none suitable were available here. Jason, who served in the Special Forces, quickly thought of using shells as an alternative. There were plenty on the ground to experiment with. However, the shells were weaker than expected and couldn't even make a cut on the softest part of the alligator's belly, which frustrated them. Jason knew the area had plenty of reeds. By stepping on them, they could get reed strips sharp like blades, which easily sliced through alligator skin, but were quite fragile, so they prepared extras. Rick, a survival instructor, knew to look for dry materials in higher areas where the trees were much drier. He also found trumpet vines, perfect for making a hearth board. Normally, hand drilling for fire was quick, but the humidity here made it very challenging, requiring more effort. The smoke increased, but there were few sparks. Rick carefully placed them in tinder and used the wind to slowly fan the flames until they finally started a fire. He gathered more firewood to wait for the dissection team. The alligator skin was tougher than expected, and it took a lot of effort to tear open. The meat inside was very tough, promising a chewy meal. The cutting went smoothly, and they planned to eat the alligator head too, using the jawbone and teeth to make various tools. After a busy half-day, they had butchered the alligator into pieces. To dry and preserve the meat, Rick built a smoking rack from branches, which helped keep bugs away and preserved the meat longer. After their hard work, the 3 men rewarded themselves with grilled meat, which was more delicious than expected. Biting into it was pure joy. The meat would surely attract animals, so they had to take turns guarding it. At night, they covered the alligator head with charcoal to slow roast it, planning to eat it roasted the next day. The idea was good, but they woke to find the alligator head had turned into charcoal. Even the bones were crunchy. They regretted not slicing it open to grill instead. It was unclear if they could complete the challenge smoothly. To hydrate, they didn't pass up even the stagnant water nearby, digging a pit next to it and using mud to filter out some contaminants. The water was very murky, but Hudson consoled himself, thinking if Bear and Ed could drink it, it must be foul-smelling but sweet-tasting. Not daring to think too much, he scooped up the water with his hands and drank it, finding it worse than toilet water. Now, their most important task was finding a suitable place to build a shelter. Everywhere was damp, and rain would surely make it worse. The mosquitoes were also a nuisance, making it especially difficult to find a good spot. After searching for a long time, Hudson finally spotted a nice location where fallen trees naturally formed a perfect structure. Building on this base would save a lot of effort. After days of hard work, Hudson's mental state was poor and his body slightly trembled. He just hoped to sleep well after building the shelter. The 3 piled branches continuously on top, ensuring it was rainproof. Otherwise, the meat would surely spoil. Rick saw Hudson bringing back materials and felt he was exhausted, almost ready to collapse. The shelter construction was more demanding than anticipated, and the rest had to wait until tomorrow. The temperature dropped significantly at night, and a thin frost formed on the ground, making it very uncomfortable to lie down. They shivered all night from the cold, and had to continue working hard at dawn, which was extremely tiring. Hudson chose to rest and slack off. Staying here was more torturous than expected, and he quickly wanted to retreat. Rick knew his spirits were low and hoped he could persevere, but Hudson felt differently. Having lived in the swamp area for years, he knew a downpour was imminent, and his body couldn't withstand it. Unexpectedly, one team member dropped out just a few days in. Hudson felt it was difficult to remain in the swamp. At midnight, a storm hit, dropping the temperature by several degrees. The shelter held up temporarily, but there was little firewood left, and they needed to gather more tomorrow. However, the rain continued nonstop. Both were soaked inside the shelter, and the worst part was water flooding around the camp. Soon they might have to sleep in puddles. Jason quickly dug a drainage ditch nearby, but the water returned to the campsite just as quickly. With no other option, they could only sit in the camp waiting for the rain to stop. The almost smoked meat became very bad due to the rain, making it impossible to eat by the last day. They also had to figure out how to hunt for new food. Now they ate as much of the jerky as they could. After several days, the rain finally stopped, and there was a lot of work to be done, not only to improve the shelter but also to collect more firewood. Unexpectedly, the alligator carcass they had left was gone, surely taken by a predator, which was not good news. Rick, ever resourceful, made a bag from the remaining alligator skin that could hold a lot of items and planned to take it home to his wife at the end of the challenge. That night, a violent storm blew down trees and roof tiles fell off severely. They spent the whole night repairing the roof, which was torturous. Only at dawn did they realize how dangerous the previous night had been. Many trees were fractured, and if they had fallen on the camp, it would have been disastrous. They didn't have much energy to relocate the shelter and had to hunt for more food. When Jason went nearby to look for edible food, a rabbit appeared right in front of him. He picked up a branch to use as a stick, slowly approached the rabbit, and struck it before it reacted. It was his first time hunting a rabbit with a stick, which was thrilling. He couldn't wait to bring it back to Boast. Rick was surprised that Jason had quickly found food, but discovered parasites in the rabbit meat while processing it. Eating it could likely cause health problems, so they ultimately gave up, hoping to find other food sources. They have been here for 18 days, collecting large amounts of firewood daily to keep the flames going. They were lucky to find a venomous snake on the road. Both approached the snake cautiously. Jason struck it with a stick, killing it instantly. They quickly cleaned the snake. It had been a long time since they had seen such fresh meat, and they were eager to bite into it directly. They roasted the meat slowly over the fire, soon smelling its aroma and enjoying the crispy bite. The meat wasn't plentiful, just enough for a snack. As for the jerky, there wasn't much left that was edible. Most of it smelled rotten. They quickly stuffed the edible parts into their mouths in order to get more food. They planned to set some simple traps using nooses and branches. The rotten alligator meat was not wasted. It helped lubricate the rope and could even serve as fuel. After such treatment, the bulrushes could burn for a long time. By the 28th day, their traps finally caught a rat. Although it wasn't very meaty, it was still quite good. Rat fur often harbors fleas, so the best method was to clean the fur by burning it off over the fire, which made it easier to clean the innards. The leftover alligator bones could be used as small knives. After cleaning, the remaining meat was exactly what they wanted, tasting so good they wished they could swallow the bones too. With this roasted meat, they managed to survive until the last day. This may have been the most exhausting month they had experienced, but the thought of going home with the prize money was exhilarating. Imagine being given a wild boar and staying in a swamp for 30 days, with a reward of $500,000 at the end. Sounds easy, right? Hold off on signing up and watch how these 3 strong men perform before making a decision. As the flare shines in the sky, Donnie rushes to the drop point, followed closely by the other 2. They soon spot the boar lying in the water. The large animal is challenging to handle without any tools, worrying them. Staying in water isn't a solution, especially near crocodile territory. They decide to move the boar to land first. Matt's wife passed away years ago, and he joined this challenge to earn money for a better life for his son. Donnie had previously participated in a wilderness survival challenge, but had to withdraw due to heart disease. He wants to prove himself. The swamp seldom has hard rocks, so they make do with seashells. Sean, a retired veteran, knows that seashells aren't enough to properly handle the meat after dark. They need sharper materials for cutting. Matt explores further and finds the area swarming with mosquitoes, a real nuisance. Fortunately, there are plenty of reeds, which can be sharpened like glass. Now, cutting the boar is much easier. To preserve the meat longer, they resort to smoking it, which also helps repel mosquitoes. To increase efficiency, Donnie goes alone to find dry materials. Cypress trees are perfect for starting fires. Peeling the bark a bit helps it dry faster, providing enough material for a good fire. Although there is plenty of water in the swamp, it isn't safe to drink directly. Without any containers to boil water, they dig a well to filter out most of the impurities from the water. While it appears murky, it is clean enough to drink. As it starts to rain, the group begins to remove the organs. Matt can't stand the swamp's stench and stuffs things into his nose. Robert, seeing this for the first time, wonders if it hurts. The meat processing goes smoothly. It's now up to Donnie to successfully start a fire. Starting a fire was harder than expected. The swamp was already damp, and the rain didn't help. Donnie struggled to keep the materials dry. Fortunately, the rain didn't last long, and the sunlight helped dry the wood a bit. However, it also accelerated the decomposition of the boar. They had to move the processed meat to Donnie's location. Without fire, the meat would probably start to smell by tomorrow. The pressure was on Donnie. He tried using a hand drill, repeatedly twisting it, but it wasn't effective. Seeing the others bring the meat over, he immediately called for help. The three of them took turns drilling, which greatly increased efficiency. Soon they saw more smoke and quickly got some sparks, which they put into tinder. By continuously blowing, the tinder finally ignited, easing their worries about the meat spoiling. To preserve the meat longer, the three men crafted a rack from tree branches and smoked the meat. The meat could now be dried and stored for future use. Even through the screen, one could sense the aroma. Biting into it, the meat was delicious and juicy. Just dealing with the boar and making fire had exhausted them, leaving no time to build a shelter. They slept around the fire for warmth at night. Bothered by mosquitoes, they comforted themselves by eating more of the roasted meat. To last 30 days in the swamp, they needed a better shelter built before the next rain. It had to be large enough for 3 people and a fire, requiring a lot of wood, which was a real test of their strength. After constant chopping and burning to achieve the right length, they managed to set up the basic structure. Now, they just needed to layer enough leaves on top. Matt's stomach was growling with hunger. He decided to roast pig's eyes for eating. Donnie, seeing someone eat pig's eyes for the first time, was curious about the taste. After roasting, Donnie chewed on the pig's eyes directly, his expression indicating a mixed taste. Indeed, the roast was much more delicious. They had few tools on hand. Sean planned to turn the pig's skull into a weapon. He cleaned off the excess fur and left the rest in the swamp water for aquatic creatures to clean off the meat. It seemed wasteful to throw away such meat that could also be delicious if boiled. They had been in the swamp for 9 days. The meat on the submerged pig's head was already eaten clean. It was unclear what tool he intended to make. Donnie used a leg bone to make a cutting tool. He had to remove the excess parts by continuously carving into it until it was sharp enough to handle by hand. The bone still contained a lot of marrow, which he planned to process into a hand axe later. However, Matt was not in good condition. He looked like he might pass out at any moment and had to rest on the ground as much as possible. His recent vomiting and constant hand on his chest alarmed the others. Donnie, recognizing the symptoms from his own heart issues, immediately called the production team for help. Unexpectedly, someone had to leave the challenge so soon. Sean suspected the dirty water might be to blame. With no time for sorrow, they had plenty of other tasks to handle. Donnie knew water was a problem. He made a simple trough on the bark to collect clean rainwater. Drinking through a straw from this setup should be clean enough. Since Matt left, their daily routine involved gathering firewood and gnawing on dried meat. The smoked and dried meat, combined with cool weather, was now tough like rubber, making it hard to bite off for anyone with poor teeth. With half the challenge still to go, they needed to ration the remaining dried meat to last until the last day. However, eating dried meat every day was unbearable. They thought about hunting for some fresh meat, but weren't sure how successful they would be. Despite having plenty of dried meat, these 2 strong men were not satisfied. There were plenty of crayfish in the swamp. They planned to make some fishing traps. Matt's basket would be larger, with openings at both ends to ensure that once the crayfish entered, they couldn't escape. Adding a large piece of meat inside, they doubted the crayfish could resist. The trap needed to be left longer to be effective. During this time, they made hunting weapons. The pig's head turned out to be very useful. Its teeth served as cutting tools. He further refined the materials with a stick, making them easier to use. Now, the skull looked like a large spearhead with sharp, finely edged bones inside, perfect for piercing animals. Sean tore off thinner pig skin, scraped off the excess, and stretched it to dry. They used it to wrap around the spearhead. Making weapons was more tiring than expected. It took a lot of effort to finish the sharp tips, and although they looked rough, their lethality was assured. Everything was ready, and it was time to hunt. They knew the swamp was full of life. Donnie ventured towards the crocodile territory. The water was too murky to see clearly. Suddenly, Hearing a crocodile, Donnie, much larger than the pig provided by the crew, got scared and quickly left the area. Matt also failed to find any game, instead feeding the local mosquitoes. As evening approached, it looked like they would have to continue with the dried meat. The two discussed moving to a different location the next day. On the 25th day, after a light rain, they collected plenty of water to drink. But drinking water wasn't enough to satisfy hunger. They needed more food, as their bodies were suffering. The traps had been set for a while, and it was time to check for any catch. If they caught something, they wouldn't need to hunt. However, the crayfish had become wise to the traps and completely ignored them. After all the effort put into making the traps, their failure was disappointing. He continued to set the traps in the water, hoping for better luck. Still, they needed to continue hunting, but first, Matt had to go back to camp to dry off. As they walked, something seemed to move ahead. Approaching, they realized it was a possum. Donnie immediately charged, weapon in hand, chasing after it. Look at this big chunk of meat, enough for them to have a full meal. They took it back to camp to clean it up. The wild boar's teeth easily separated the skin and fur, and then they peeled it off as easily as removing a sock. They skewered the meat on branches and grilled it over the fire, craving the fresh meat they hadn't tasted in a long time. They wanted to bite into it right away. Grilled until golden brown on both sides, you could smell the aroma even through the screen. This was definitely the tastiest barbecue they had ever eaten. The remaining dried meat just barely helped them last until the end of the challenge. They proved themselves and could now leave with souvenirs. After watching the contestants' performances, everyone wonders how many days they could stay here. Personally, I wouldn't want to stay even one day. I wonder who else will come to take on the challenge.